thank you all for being here. My name is Claire Spencer, as Ms. Britt said, and this is my capstone research project. It is entitled Context Clues and Cultural Conflict, Nationalism versus Internationalism in the Museum World. And my research took the form of looking at conversations within the museum world and within those who are doing cultural and historical work. These conversations on where we should have cultural property, where it came from, where it should go, who should have access to it, and who should have it in one country versus a different country. And the main portion of my research was a literature review. So I surveyed about 25 to 30 different academic articles and news articles that looked at this conversation, this debate over cultural property, and that was the bulk of my research. And I will just be touching on a few points within that in my presentation today. So first off, what is cultural property? Because I know that that is a term that most of you are probably unfamiliar with. So we have John Henry Merriman, a quote from him. He's a foremost legal scholar within museum work, and he states that cultural property consists of objects of artistic, archaeological, ethnological, or historical interest. We also have a quote from Hague 1954, which is an important cultural internationalist document, and it states, cultural property consists of monuments of architecture, art, or history, archaeological sites, groups of buildings, works of art, manuscripts, books, scientific collections, and important collections of books or archives. So that is a bit of definition on cultural property. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to show you cultural property because I feel like it's easy to think that it could be a piece of art on the wall, but it actually, as we can see from that definition, consists of so much more. So of course we do have things like the Mona Lisa, but we also have the Magna Carta and Michelangelo's David. And on the next slide we have Taj Mahal, Rosetta Stone, and the bust of Nefertiti. So these are all cultural property items. And obviously these are heavy hitters. Most of you probably know at least one or two of these things. But cultural property is not just these famous, prominent items. It also consists of lesser-known works and anything that falls within that definition, those two definitions that I showed a few slides ago. I want to start off with the debate conversation touching on cultural internationalism, which I have subtitled Artifacts Transcending Borders. Because, once again, we have John Henry Merriman, who states, one way of thinking about cultural property is as components of a common human culture, whatever their places of origin or present location, independent of property rights or national jurisdiction. So the cultural internationalist views cultural property as belonging to all of humanity. Instead of thinking that these artifacts should just belong in one place of the world, maybe the place where they were created or originally came from, the cultural internationalist instead believes that cultural property should really go wherever it is best taken care of, wherever the most amount of people can see it, and wherever it makes sense for it to fall in the realm of other cultural property. Hague 1954 is considered a charter for cultural internationalism, and I had a quote from it a couple of slides ago, but it is considered a charter for cultural internationalism because it includes laws within it for countries to follow. It was a convention that took place in 1954 that resulted in this document that really has some compelling reasons behind the cultural internationalist perspective. And in my literature review, I had a whole section on law where I touched on this in greater detail. It could be a capstone entirely of its own, but that is the very short spiel on Hague 1954. Also part of the cultural internationalist viewpoint is the universal and encyclopedic museum. So this is considered one of the core tenets of cultural internationalism, this belief that we should have museums that are universal and encyclopedic, that have a large array of cultural property from all over the world. So next slide, please. And here's some examples of universal and encyclopedic museums, two really well-known examples, the British Museum and the Louvre. And then other examples include the Met in the US, the Egyptian Museum in Egypt, and Gallery of the Academy in Italy. And these are just a few examples. There are many universal museums. And then next, cultural nationalism. I subtitled this Artifacts Inseparable from Culture because in contrast to the cultural internationalists, The cultural nationalists would believe that items of cultural heritage are tied to the cultural identity of the citizens of its source nation, that it rightfully belongs to those citizens or that nation, and that those items of cultural property do not need to be removed. Similarly to Hague 1954 being a charter for for cultural internationalism, we have UNESCO 1970 as a charter for cultural nationalism. And again, I covered this in my law section on my literature review, and it just is a set of principles and laws that some countries subscribe to that backs up the cultural nationalist viewpoint. Cultural nationalism is also the foremost point of view and the foremost school of thought within the museum world. It's something that has been really brought into the conversation, this question of where do we get these items of cultural property? How did we get these items of cultural property, and is that legitimate? Should they belong in the British Museum or should they belong in their source country? And these questions, specifically within cultural nationalism, are really foremost in the psyche of a lot of people doing cultural and museum work currently. Next slide, please. To kind of illustrate this debate between cultural internationalism, cultural nationalism, I wanted to bring up a case study, the case of the Parthenon or Elgin marbles. So raise your hand if you are familiar with the Parthenon or Elgin marbles. If you've heard of them, if you're familiar with them. Okay, awesome. My mom's raising her hand because she read my whole literature. So I really wanted to get into these perspectives based on an actual case study that is occurring, that's very contemporary and has been occurring for several years. This is the case of a set of statues that was taken from Greece and has now been placed in the British Museum, where they've been for over 200 years. But the cultural internationalist and cultural nationalist debate can really be seen in this conversation. So first, for those of you who are unfamiliar, which is totally fine, the question we have is, what on earth are the Parthenon, also known as the Elgin marbles? And these are a group of sculptures depicting mainly mythological scenes from the 5th century BC Athenian temple of Parthenon, the most prominent architectural feature of the Acropolis. So that's a lot of words, that's a lot of fancy language, but they're a set of statues that have been taken from Greece that were part of the Parthenon, a very important set of statues that is tied to the Greek cultural identity that has been taken and put into the British Museum. Next slide, please. To give a bit of historical background, in 1801, Thomas Bruce, who was the 7th Earl of Elgin, he removed the marbles from Greece. He struck up a deal with the Ottomans, who were the occupying power in Greece at the time, and he brought them home with him to England. He purchased them and brought them home. In 1816, Lord Elgin ran into a bit of trouble with the bank. He was having some money issues, and so he sold the marbles to the British Museum. And part of the stipulation that took place in this transaction, he said that in order for the British Museum to buy them, they had to refer to the Parthenon marbles as the Elgin marbles. They had to be named after him. And so this is why, in a lot of cases, specifically within England, specifically on the website of the British Museum, places like that, you will find that they are referred to as the Elgin marbles. But people who are from Greece, Greece itself as a government, and other people who are of the more cultural nationalist mindset tend to refer to them instead as the Parthenon marbles, which is their original name. And I chose to refer to them as the Parthenon marbles, both in my literature review and in this work today. In 1983, we're skipping a bit, Greece officially requested the return of the marbles for the first time. And this is really where that cultural internationalist and cultural nationalist debate comes in, because there are several perspectives at play here. On the one hand, these marbles were purchased. They were purchased in 1801. The thing that some people have an issue with is that they were purchased from an occupying power. Greece officials did not sell these marbles. They were instead sold by that occupying power to Lord Elgin before they were taken to England. And some people have an issue with that, whereas some people say at the time that was perfectly legitimate. Also, from the cultural internationalist perspective, a lot of people visit the British Museum. This is a very highly traveled to museum. They are very well taken care of, and they have been there for over 200 years. But looking at the cultural nationalist perspective, we can see that these are statues that are very closely tied to the Greek national identity. They are important symbolically and they are important culturally, and to have them in England instead of having them in Greece can be seen as a form of denying people who should rightfully have those statues in their home country, denying a piece of their cultural property. Today, Greece continues to request the return of the marbles, and the British Museum continues to deny this request. And this may seem surprising, especially because, as I mentioned, cultural nationalism is currently the foremost school of thought. This is something that has brought a lot of controversy to the British Museum, and you may have even heard of some of this controversy yourself, if not necessarily specifically within this Parthenon marbles discussion, within other discussions of other artifacts that are also within the museum. But they continue to deny this request, and this was really thought-provoking to me personally. I really was thinking, why on earth would they continue to deny this request? And next slide, please. We will see that actually British law does not allow the museum to return the marbles at this point. Hannah Godwin had a wonderful article I utilized quite a bit in my literature review, where she goes a lot into British museum law. And she has a quote that states the 3 reasons in which an artifact can be returned, and these reasons: 1, if there is a duplicate, and as far as I know, there is not a duplicate of the Parthenon marbles. If y'all know of one, let us know, please. 2, if it appears to have been printed after 1850 of printed matter to which the trustees have a copy of, not applicable. Or 3, if the objects are unfit and is a detriment to the interests of students. Well, depending on how you look at it, obviously it is an interest to students. So this does not fall into any of those 3 categories, which, again, depending on your perspective, fortunately or unfortunately, at this time, British law does not allow for the artifacts to be returned. And British parliamentary law would have to change to return the marbles at this point. And this is a very contemporary conversation. As you can see, these articles that I have pulled up right now, they were all published within the last 4 months. They were published this year in 2023. And talks have been taking place between British officials and Greek officials to discuss what will be done about these marbles. Because again, this is a conversation that has been taking place for a very long time. And these questions of should they be returned, should maybe a long-term loan be in place so that Greece can have these marbles for a period of time before they come back to England. These are questions that have been discussed, and I did not feel fully comfortable with giving a firm answer because an official word has not yet been released. But as you can see from this specific article, published March 13th, 2023, at this time it does not appear as though the marbles will be returned. Next slide. So to conclude, the conversation between cultural internationalism and cultural nationalism is ongoing. The fate of the Parthenon marbles seems to hang in the balance. We're not really sure what will become of that, but at this point it does seem as though they are unlikely to be returned. But we can learn from this case study because it helps us see that it's not a simple conversation. The cultural internationalist and cultural nationalist debate is very complex. There are many other things involved that I wasn't able to touch much on in my presentation today, but things like law, which I did touch on briefly, things about separate countries having separate laws and separate sets of stipulations that affects this conversation. And we can see from the marbles that there are different points of view, like, was it legitimate that the Ottomans sold the marbles? Was that a legitimate purchase, or was that illegitimate? There are so many different ways to look at this conversation, which is why this is a particularly wonderful case study, because we can see that it's very contemporary and that we are still trying to figure this out as a group of people in our individual societies and cultures. We're still trying to get to the bottom of how we feel about this. Next slide, please. These are the references that I use specifically within my PowerPoint. My literature review has a much longer set of references. That would be a whole PowerPoint itself. And then, I just wanted to say thank you to a couple of people. Thank you so much to Dr. Ainsworth and Mr. Williams, my wonderful Capstone mentors, who put so much time and effort into helping me with this project. Thank you so much. Thank you to Ms. Burke, the most wonderful honors program coordinator ever. And thank you to my family, loved ones, professors, anyone and everyone who has supported me along the way, my peers, friends. If you're here today, thank you for being here to support my presentation. Yes, right.
Do we know Lord Elgin's, I don't know if I said that right, his motives in buying the statues? Was he like, just thought it was cool, or was he like trying to preserve anything since they were under different possession?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at that point, kind of the thought was from a lot of British people at the time was, we are the foremost nation, and so how better can we preserve these items than to have them here in England with us? So I think in some ways he was interested in them they were part of his personal collection for a while, so in some ways he was interested in them. From the viewpoint of a personal collector, I think in some ways he thought that they would probably be better taken care of in England, so to speak. And then he probably just thought they were cool. You know, it was like a souvenir shop kind of thing. Like, oh man. And he had a lot of money, so he could do it. That's a great question. Yeah, Sarah.
So has there been any thought into looking into just creating a replica for the museum so that we can send the originals back?
Good question. I think that is something that definitely could be interesting, because a replica, especially at this point, because we have the tools to make a very beautiful replica, I think that could be really neat. Part of what makes them so priceless and symbolic is that they're one of a kind. In Greece, I know that a couple of people on the Greece trip said that there were like blank spots where the sculptures were supposed to be, like at the Parthenon, and it said these were taken by the British Museum. And so it's almost this level of they're one of a kind, and Greece doesn't have them, England does. So I think if replicas were to be made, they definitely should go in the British Museum, and the originals should go back. So, but that's an interesting thought. Okay, yeah.
Do you know how much the Elgin marbles were?
Oh, how much they cost? That's a great question. Probably more than $5. I don't know much more than that, but they were probably great. Yes, Dr. Cook.
So this is so troubling ethically, which is the point,
Yes.
right? I was with the student for the first part, so if you already answered this, I'm sorry. So who makes these laws? Is it, when we're dealing with it internationally, is it just kind of worrying national laws? Is there a movement to have an international perspective on this? Because it seems like there's a lot of pushback to taking people's art. You know, it seems like we're claiming it's frowned upon.
Yes, that's a great question. We do see these different law documents like UNESCO 1954 and Hague 1954 and UNESCO 1970. We see them come into play, but the issue with those is that it does take an individual country being willing to subscribe to that set of stipulations.
There's no enforcing body.
So yes, and I think those were kind of the efforts, was to have it become international so that all countries would be involved, so that all countries would kind of sign up to be part of that movement. Like, yeah, we're not going to steal people's stuff, but right. But I think it's at this point, there are still so many questions, especially about what we should do about cultural property that has been just stolen. So like in colonial situations, just stolen, taken from places and not returned. And there have been some efforts to return things like that. So I think it really, right now, is a country by country situation. I know France recently returned a lot of artifacts that they had taken recently, or they didn't take them recently, they returned them recently. But yeah, that would not be cool. That would be a little messed up. But yes, so right now it's country by country, but I would love to see something more international come. Yes?
Well, I was thinking about how much this has to do with like a reckoning or a lack of reckoning with the colonial past.
Yes.
In terms of like, what's the slippery slope involved from like the perspective of the British Museum and the laws protecting it, of like,
Absolutely.
if we return this, what do we have to return?
Exactly.
Like the precedent it sets, and not that it's good logic necessarily for keeping it, but like what would be in the British Museum if they did have to return everything from there?
My favorite question. Also, a heavy hitter, the Rosetta Stone. Give back the Rosetta Stone. Maybe, possibly. I think this is something that a lot of people actually have been thinking about. Just if we return these, we will be having to return a lot of different items. And it was something that I talked about quite a bit in my literature review. I was able to go into it more extensively. It's interesting because a lot of cultural nationalists say that it's more these objects of higher symbolism, that have a higher symbolic nature to them. It's a little bit different with items that, yes, maybe were stolen, but they're not necessarily as missed, which sounds very harsh. But there is the reality of things like the Universal Encyclopedic Museum. Those are important. Those are important, and nobody that I've read about, a lot of people are saying this idea of, oh no, we'll just have to empty all of them. That is not going to happen. It would just be these objects with higher symbolism, like Parthenon marbles, like the Rosetta Stone, things like that would have to be returned, yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Wang.
So is there any like negotiation or like effort between the Greek and British governments saying that maybe the Greek can say, if we cannot our artifacts back, can we like borrow it for like 5-6 years and then return that to you?
Yes, that's a great question. And that actually is something that took place within some of those talks, where it was the possibility of, well, maybe if we can't return them permanently, we could do a long-term loan. I think some people have concerns due to the priceless nature of these statues, of them traveling back and forth like that. I think that a long-term loan would be better than nothing, so to speak. It would be better for them to have them for, maybe 10, 20, 30 years. I think that that would be better than them not having them at all. So I think that that was something that was happening in the negotiations, but Greece, according to what I read, was kind of like, if we can't have them permanently, we're not sure if we want them back at all. Because of the symbolism inherent in that, just the fact that it's still a long-term loan, it still doesn't belong to us. There's a lot of power in owning something, and that power would still rest with the British Museum at that time when they did that.
Because that's what France was doing with South Korea actually.
Yeah.
Because like there were lots of books published at the South Korean palace like several hundred years ago, and France took some of them.
Right.
And they say, oh, we cannot return this, but we can lend these to you for 5 years, and then we're going to get them back.
And I think that's a way of kind of getting around that law, getting around those laws that we saw, which again would be effective and would be a better option. So I think it's definitely something that they talked about. Thank you for your question.